guys, it's Courtney. I'm back here with another design team project for Scrapping for Less. Today I'm going to be using the Through Thick and Thin stamp set by Gina Designs, and we're going to be doing some no-line coloring, well, sort of no-line coloring, and I'm going to show you how to get some good results, especially if you're new with no-line coloring. I'm actually going to be stamping out 2 panels for myself, and I'll do the no-line Copic coloring with you guys, and then I plan on doing some watercoloring off camera that I'll share at a later date. So I'm going to be using Blackout ink by Ink on 3, and this is both waterproof and Copic safe, but it's also a jet black image. So I'm using a stamp positioner here, and I'm stamping it on a scrap piece of paper, putting that aside, and then second generation stamping onto my card panel itself. And you can see that I still get a pretty good image, but it's a very light gray. Now these lines won't fade away. You can certainly use like an antique linen distress ink, or I know there's like the fade out ink, which will actually kind of disappear as you're doing your coloring or your watercoloring. But this, I want to still be able to see the lines. It's great if you're still kind of new to no line coloring, or if no line coloring completely terrifies you like it does me sometimes. So this way I'll keep my lines, but they'll be very faint. And once everything is said and done, I'll pretty much be the only one to know that those lines are there. So after I stamped my first flower, I cut out a mask and masked that out with Inkadinka masking paper and repositioned my flower on top of the first one. And I'm just kind of moving my mask around for both of my panels, but bringing out that scrap piece of paper each and every time, stamping that first and then moving on to my main panel. And now the watercolor paper, which is this one right here, is textured. So you're going to want to make sure that you give this a ton of pressure, because you're going to not get a crisp image every single time, no matter even if you use a stamp positioner or not, just because of the texture of the paper. And here I'm moving on to the leaves, doing the same thing, stamping out on that scrap piece of paper, then bringing in my panel. You can see that I'm kind of losing the stick of my mask there, but I'm not going to be using this for any ink blending or anything like that, so I'm not too worried about it as long as it covers up that flower. Just continuing to move that back and forth, and now I'm using also the mask for the one leaf. I'm going to have 2 leaves towards the bottom, and then I'll finish off with a leaf towards the top coming off of the top flower. And like I said, we're just going to be doing the Copic coloring for this particular video. And you can see that I got a very good impression on the Nina, and the other paper I'm using is Canson watercolor paper. So once all of my stamping is done, we'll move right into the Copic coloring, and I'm starting right off with my lightest color, and I'm only doing 1 petal at a time here. I find that it's easiest to do 1 petal at a time when it's no line coloring, just so I kind of can keep track of what I'm doing. So I'm going in with my lightest color to kind of put down some ink and get the paper saturated a little bit, kind of laying out where my darkest colors will be. Next, I'm bringing in that darkest color, and you can see that I have my marker pretty much straight up and down, because I'm just barely touching the tip of the marker to the paper, and I know my hand is in the way, so it's hard to see what I'm doing. But I'm basically following the lines within the illustration. So this particular stamp set is very, very detailed. And if I wasn't doing a no line coloring and I just stamped this in black, you could pretty much color this in solid, and those lines within the image, or that detail within the image, is going to kind of carry through, and you can kind of rely on that if you're not doing no line coloring. But we're also going to rely on it when we're doing the no line coloring, because we're going to use those lines to our advantage. This is going to give each and every petal a whole lot of texture, not just dimension, but texture. So I'm just following those little flick lines that are within the image, and I'm also creating a shadow there where this one leaf is kind of petal is kind of underneath the petal next to it. I'm extending those flicks out each and every time as I go down my E15, then my Y26, and then finally finishing off with that latest color again. But I'm quickly going over the area. I'm not going to over blend here, because I want to keep those flick lines. That's what's going to give me the detail. So we'll move on to the next petal here, and each of these petals are shaped a little bit different, but they all have as much detail as the one next to it. So I'm going to fill in the entire area, again, getting that paper saturated to make my colors blend a little bit easier. Going to create that shadow where this petal is laying underneath the first one that we colored, and then going in with those little flicks. And again, I know my hand is in the way. It's hard to tell when you're recording what you're covering up and what you're not until you go back and watch it. But hopefully you guys can get the idea. And I'm not going to show you all of the coloring here. I'm just going to show you a few of the petals. Now on the tips of the petals, you can see how some of them are kind of folded a little bit. And you can clearly see that within the image itself. I'm using that to my advantage, and some of those little flick lines that I'm creating, especially where the petal is folded, I'm making those lines just a little bit thicker. And then when I move down to the E15 and the Y26, I'm shading those little folds just to one side. I'm not necessarily making it thicker on both sides, but I'm extending that line out just on one side. And it really honestly doesn't matter which side you choose, just as long as you shade on the same side each and every time, if that makes sense to you. So if you're going to extend that line on the left-hand side, keep going on the left-hand side throughout that entire petal. So we're going to move on to this middle petal here, and this is a teeny tiny one, so there's not going to be a whole lot of shadow with this. It's mainly going to be on the bottom part where it meets that other petal that's kind of sticking out, and then just one little flick line there on the top, just because that is part of the image, that detail. So again, using that to my advantage. Now you can see I'm bringing out the scrap piece of paper that I had stamped off on, and I'm just using this image as a guide. Because my ink is so light at this point, being at second generation stamping, it's sometimes hard to see what you're coloring or where these details are, or the shape of the petal, where the petal ends or begins. So you can either bring out the packaging of the stamp, or in this case, being I'd already stamped it on the scrap piece of paper, I'm just using that as my guide. So I'll keep that off to this side just in case I need it. So we're working on the petal directly above the one we just colored, and that's going to create a shadow because that first little tiny petal is kind of hanging over this one. I'm going to create a shadow where those two meet. So anytime one object is laying over another, that is going to create a shadow. It's up to you how dark you want that shadow to be. Now, the E18 is an extremely dark color. So if you don't feel comfortable with using such a dark color, don't. But that is what's going to give you the contrast. I know that I always say it's the scary dark color. If you're not getting the results that you're looking for, whether it be through no line coloring or just regular Copic coloring, if you're not getting that contrast, it's probably because you're not using a dark enough color as your shadow color. And you can use it very, very sparingly. Just put it in the very, very darkest areas, and you're going to notice a huge difference. You're going to get a whole lot more contrast. So moving on to the next petal, again, creating that shadow where this one is hanging underneath that one above it. And then using those lines again to my advantage to create some texture within the petals. And you want to make sure that your nibs are in good shape for an image like this, because I'm barely touching the tip of the marker to the paper. That's how you're going to get those really fine lines. If your nib is kind of frayed at the end, which some of my markers are, especially the ones that I got in the beginning when I first started Copic coloring, because I wasn't used to the brush nib. So I tend to press a little bit hard sometimes when I wasn't used to them. So some of my nibs are a little frayed and they desperately need replacing, but those are expensive. So it's little by little as far as the Copic maintenance goes. So this is the last petal I'm going to show you guys, but I'm basically doing the same thing. And then I continued coloring the rest of this flower as well as the flower directly above it, the same exact way, same color combination. And it took me a while. I'm not going to lie, the no line coloring does take quite a bit of time. I think this whole card took me about 2 to 2.5 hours. So we're going to move on to the middle part of the flowers, and I'm going to bring in some E50 markers. And I'm going to start off with my lightest color, again, getting that paper saturated. And I'm just placing that where my darkest areas will be, which will pretty much be where that petal is laying over the middle part of the flower. Then I'm going to bring in my E59, which is my darkest color, and I'm going to create that shadow first with, again, just the tip of my marker, which is why my marker is straight up and down. And then I'm going to put little tiny dots. And this is going to give the inside of the flower, the middle part of the flower, some texture. I'm placing the dots pretty close together where the darkest area of this part of the flower would be. Then bringing in the E57, going directly over the first dots I made, and then just extending those dots out a little bit further. As I extend them out further, they're going to get further apart. So the darker areas, they're real close together, and then they kind of separate out a little bit. Once I got down to my lightest color, I realized that it wasn't quite dark enough for me. So I brought back in that E57 and just added a few more dots and extended those out a little bit further. Then bringing in the E55, doing that same thing, going over the same dots that we created with the E57 and just extending them out a little bit further. And then finally going in with that lightest color. Did the same exact thing for the other flower, and we'll move on to the leaves. Now, my lightest color for this is going to be the YG11, and you'll see that I kind of start bringing in other colors as well. Sometimes I'll grab some colors or a color combination that I think I'm going to use and realize that I need to maybe add some more. There's no limit as to the number of colors you can use on each of the images. I think for the second one, I use like 6 of my green markers, but I'm just creating the shadow where this leaf is hanging underneath that other leaf next to it, and also where it's coming out from underneath the flower. Also using those lines within the image to my advantage to create some texture. Blending that out with the G24, and this is where I realized that for the other 2 leaves, I'm probably going to have to bring in something between the G24 and the G28, just because this leaf ended up being a little bit lighter than what I wanted it to be. But I'm just extending those lines out, extending that shadow out that we had created for underneath the flower and the other leaf. Bringing in the G82 and extending that out a little bit further, each one of those flicks. Again, extending these flicks on this in the same direction. So in this case, I'm shading underneath the little flicks that are on the side of the leaf. And in the middle where the vein is, I do add some shading on both sides of that, just because that's the veins within the leaf. So it's a little bit different. Going in with the G12 and then finally going back in with the YG marker, which will kind of just brighten it up a little bit. But this is where I kind of realize it's a little bit too light. So you can go back in and add a little bit more shading or a little bit more shadow. And I'm just going to go in with my G28 and kind of darken up some of those flick lines. I may have over blended in certain areas and I lost some of those details. So I'm just going to go in with my G28, and this is the G82, and just kind of blend those out a little bit and then leave it as is. Next, I'm going to go on to the next leaf, and this is where I start bringing in other colors to kind of get the results that I'm looking for. But again, going in first with my lightest color, and I'm going to cover up the entire area to get all of the leaf saturated. Again, the G28 will be my darkest color, and for this one is hanging on top of the other leaf. So there's not necessarily going to be a shadow there, but there will be a shadow where it's hanging underneath the flower. Kind of just tracing that vein within the leaf right in the center, and then again using those flicks within the image to create that texture I'm looking for. And you can also create your own. You know, if you are using an ink that maybe you're kind of lost those lines along the way, once you color over them, you can make them up. Or you can use that other one, the packaging or where we stamped off, as a guide as to where these flick lines are, where these detail lines are, or like I've done, kind of created my own. So you can see that I brought in the G46 for the darkest midtone, I guess. Then moving on to the G24, and I think the G20 or G46 was the only one that I brought in here in addition, but I just needed something in between just because that first leaf was just not dark enough that just wasn't getting the results. So feel free to bring in as many colors as you need to get the results that you're looking for. So I'm going to go ahead and finish up this leaf, and the leaf there on the top I colored pretty much the same way, so I'm not going to show you this one. But what we're going to do next is we're going to create a drop shadow, which basically is going to make the images look like they're popped off the paper, even though this is a one layer card. So I'm going to take my C5 and I'm basically just outlining my images, and I am creating a shadow off to the bottom left. So it's going to be all along the left-hand side and then underneath those two leaves. Next, going in with the C3, and I'm going to go right over that C5 and just extend it out a little bit further. You can see that the first time around, I used just the tip of my marker. Now I'm still using the tip of the marker, but I'm making these lines a little bit thicker. I'm also going to create a little bit of a shadow underneath that bottom part of that top flower. Then I'm going to go in with my C1, and you can see my marker is kind of tilted to the side now because I'm using more of the side of the nib because I'm extending that shadow out even further. I did have some harsh lines, so I'm going to go back in with that mid-tone and kind of blend that C5 out a little bit further, and then go back in again with that C1 to extend that further. And you can see each time I kind of go down, my marker is tilted a little bit more, and this just kind of shows you what part of the nib I'm using and how thick of a line I want to get. So once that's done, I wanted to kind of frame this in. It was kind of looking a little bit plain. So I'm going to take my T-square ruler, and I'm using an EK Success journaling pen, which is a Copic safe pen. I don't plan on going right over my images, but just in case, I don't want any of my pen to bleed. And I think I'm going about a half or about a quarter of an inch maybe. And I'm just going to frame this in, and I'm going around my images. So where my ruler meets the leaves and the flower, I'm just kind of skipping over that part. And I'm going to do this on all four sides, and I'm not going to stop in the corners. I'm going to kind of just extend that to the edge of the paper. And this will kind of just give it a little bit something extra. Once that was done, I am going to, first I had a little smudge that I fixed with my sand eraser there in the top right. I don't know whether you can see it on camera, but I'm going to take one of the sentiments from the stamp set, and I'm going to go ahead and stamp that down with the VersaFine Onyx Black ink, which is a fast drying pigment ink, but it does take a minute or two to dry. So just keep that in mind. You don't want to kind of mess with your card panel until that is completely dry. And finally, I took some of the new Nuvo Dream Drops and just placed those kind of around that white area, that blank area. And that is it. That is the card for today, guys. Thanks so much for stopping by, and have a great day. Bye.